Welcome to another presentation. As usual, an illustrated PDF is available by clicking the link on the YouTube page. You may remember that I posted a presentation last year entitled "Who were the parents of Edward de Vere's son?" The implication being that they were not who you thought they were. If you haven't watched this, I suggest you do so. Otherwise, what I'm about to tell you will not make a lot of sense. There's good evidence to suggest there was a great scandal in the life of Edward de Vere during the 1590s. It was of such magnitude as to derail his life, leading to his metamorphosis into the shadowy figure of William Shakespeare, and appears to have influenced the themes of the sonnets. A number of authors, including Alexander Ware, have argued that the scandal involved the parentage of de Vere's son Henry, born in 1593. In other words, he was not the father. In my previous presentation, I provided strong evidence that the father was Henry Wriothesley, the 19-year-old third Earl of Southampton. The unresolved issue is the identity of his mother. Alexander has put forward this lady. She's Lady Penelope Rich, the wife of Robert Rich, 3rd Baron Rich and 1st Earl of Warwick. In my earlier analysis, I raised some doubts about this, among them the unlikelihood of being able to fit another pregnancy in between those known to have taken place. Penelope had 5 children by her husband Robert Rich, the last of whom was Henry Rich, later 1st Earl of Holland, who was baptised on around the 19th of August 1590. He was executed on the 9th of March 1649 at the age of 58, and all sources agree on this. Around 1590, Penelope began an affair with Sir Charles Blount. Lord Rich was prepared to accept the situation in order to maintain his links with Penelope's brother, Robert Devereux. Together they had 6 children, but it's the first of these, called Penelope, who's of interest to us, in particular her date of birth. There's no argument about her father being Charles Blount, even though she was given the surname of Rich, as she is mentioned in his will. I'll return to this later, as the circumstances surrounding the document may be of some relevance. I'm going to refer to her when unmarried as Penelope Blount, to avoid any confusion with her mother, and then Penelope Clifton after her marriage. So this is the question we must address. If Penelope Rich was the mother of Henry de Vere, was it possible for her to squeeze in the pregnancy of young Penelope between the births of these 2 Henrys? Now, both of Penelope Rich's biographers confirm that her daughter Penelope was christened at St Clement Danes Church in the Strand on the 30th of March 1592. The church in those days was very different from the one we know today, as it was rebuilt in 1680 and again after World War II. The important point is that it lies very close indeed to Essex House, the London home of Robert Devereux, where Penelope herself had an apartment and spent much time. This lends weight to the view that this was where the birth took place, at a date close to the christening, an argument strengthened by the fact that Penelope had lost a previous daughter soon after birth. Alexander Ware has raised the perfectly reasonable point that it was not uncommon for christenings to take place months, if not years, after the birth. The argument is strengthened by the age at the time of death of Penelope recorded on her memorial. Now, I'll come back to this later in more detail, but she is recorded as dying on the 26th of October 1613 at the age of 23. Before we go any further, let's look at what we know about the timing of baptism in the 16th century. Considerable research has been carried out in this field of study. The Sarum Manual, which preceded the Book of Common Prayer, was in force until 1549. It stated that baptism should only be delayed for children born 8 days before Easter and Whitsun. At all other times of year, baptism should be performed promptly after birth. The principle was that prior to the Reformation, being baptised was a prerequisite for entry into heaven. The Book of Common Prayer, edited and co-written by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, was printed in 1549. It was like an instruction manual to aid the clergy in performance of their duties. Although most churches had a copy, few of the worshippers would have been able to read it. It placed strong emphasis on public baptism, carried out by the clergy, rather than the more informal private baptism carried out by lay members. Although Cranmer believed that an infant who died unbaptized could still enter heaven, lack of baptism was still judged to be an affront to God on the parent's behalf by refusing his ministry. The advice for clergy in the book reads as follows. The pastors and curates shall oft admonish the people that they defer not the baptism of infants any longer than the next Sunday, or any other holy day next after the child is born, unless upon a great and reasonable cause declared to the curate and by him approved. And also they shall warn them that without great cause and necessity they should baptize not children in their own houses. David Cressy, in his book Births, Marriages and Death Ritual and the Cycle of Life in Tudor and Stuart England, states that most Elizabethan babies were baptized 2 to 3 days after birth. Higher status families sometimes delayed matters to make necessary arrangements. I would suggest that given the circumstances of Penelope Blount's birth, there would not have been a lot to arrange, as it's unlikely that there was a great congregation. This interval is further supported in an article entitled Baptism Intervals for Family Historians by Stuart Baston from the University of Cambridge. The report is on the website of Family Search, run by the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Evidence strongly suggests that during the 16th and much of the 17th centuries, parents did indeed baptize in haste. As such, family historians working on the early modern period can usually assume that any date they uncover, either in the parish register or on the International Genealogical Index, which specifies baptism, will normally be no more than a week after the birth. So I'm going to stick to my guns here and say that it's beyond reasonable doubt that Penelope Blount's baptism was within a week of her birth. Now let's look at Henry de Vere. The date of his conception is arrived at by using the pregnancy calculator, which assumes gestation is 40 weeks from the first day of the last period. Conception would then have taken place around 2 weeks later. He was born on the 24th of February 1593. Working backwards, we arrive at June the 1st. Now you may remember this from my last presentation. It's an enlargement of a representation of the calendar from January to June of 1592. There's no need to worry about when the years ended or began, or indeed the days. All we're interested in are the weeks. The yellow boxes indicate the last trimester of Penelope Rich's pregnancy with her daughter Penelope Blount. The brown boxes show the beginning of the pregnancy of Henry de Vere. The red box marks the date of Penelope's baptism. In my last presentation, I opined that the birth was close to that of Henry, and I chose to use a birth date 2 weeks prior to the baptism. Given what I've learned since, I think we can reduce this to at the most 1 week. This reduces the interval between Penelope's birth and the start of Henry de Vere's pregnancy to just 10 weeks, making it very unlikely that Penelope Rich was the mother of both children. Now let's look at Henry Rich. There's some mental gymnastics involved here, so bear with me. You might just want to pause, rewind and watch again. His date of death seems sound in view of the fact that he was executed, so we can take this as the 9th of March, 1649. He was baptised on the 15th of August, 1590, which is consistent with the analysis, and tells us that he could not have been born after that date. So assume his birth date was in the week before this. If we put this diagrammatically, the pregnancy is between the 8th to 15th of November 1589 to the 8th to 15th of August 1590. Now let's look at the scenario of Penelope Blount being 23 at the time of her death on the 26th of October 1613, as suggested by the inscription on her memorial. The date of her birth is not known, as the baptism was delayed. She must, of course, have had a birthday during the previous 12 months. The last date for this would have been the 26th of October 1590, i.e. the day she died. The earliest date would have been the 27th of October 1589. There would, of course, have been a corresponding conception window, preceding the birth by 9 months and running from the 27th of January 1589 to the 26th of January 1590. In total, then, Penelope Rich could have been pregnant with her daughter between the dates of the 27th of January 1589 to the 26th of October 1590. Now let's put these two together. As you can see, there's something of an overlap. Let's just suppose Penelope Blount was born before Henry Rich. Then if Penelope Rich had fallen pregnant on the earliest date, 27th of January 1589, she would have delivered around the 27th of October 1589. By 3 weeks later, she would have been pregnant with Henry Rich, a remote possibility to say the least. Conception at any later date than the 15th of February 1589 would clash directly with that of Henry Rich. Even if the baptism of Henry had been delayed, then his conception would have been earlier than the 15th of November 1589, making a clash more likely. Now, in the interests of clarity of the presentation, I've made assumptions about the length of the pregnancies in providing precise dates for the analysis. However, I do not believe that the usual fluctuation in the length of pregnancy would invalidate the conclusion. Of course, if Penelope had been born a year later in 1591, there would have been ample room to avoid a conflict at both ends. But if she were 23 or 20, she just doesn't fit. So why then did she have to be 23? To understand this, we need to go to the village of Clifton in Nottinghamshire. This drawing shows Clifton Hall, the family seat of the Clifton family, in 1676. In this rather fanciful painting by Sibberechts, Nottingham is on the left, with the River Trent meandering across the river valley. On the right sits the church of St Mary Clifton, with the hall nestled against it on the left, sitting on the edge of the cliff. The hall was rebuilt in the late 18th century, and after the end of the Clifton's family tenure, it became a school and recently was divided into 2 apartments, one of which sold a couple of months ago for £1.5 million. Standing just next to it on the right is the Church of St Mary Clifton. This is the last resting place for the Clifton family, including Penelope. Some parts of the building date back to around 1190. Inside is a booklet detailing the pedigree of the Cliftons. The Clifton family traced their lineage back to Alvaradus de Clifton, a Norman knight who was appointed warden of Nottingham Castle in the time of William the Conqueror. The family culminates for our purposes in the 12th generation with Sir Gervase Clifton, who lived from 1587 to 1666. His epithet was the Great. He was a politician active on both a local and national level for many years, and he had 7 wives. The first was the beautiful Penelope Blount, whom he married in around 1609. They had 1 child, Sir Gervase Clifton. Sometime after 1630, Gervase commissioned a memorial to his first 3 wives. This is a plan of the church. The mausoleum of the Cliftons is to the right of the chancel, containing the body of Penelope in an uninscribed coffin. This is the chancel of the church, and on the right you can just see the door leading to the Clifton mausoleum. Above the door sits the memorial of Sir Gervase Clifton, his bust below his own coat of arms and surrounded by those of his 7 wives. This is a carved tablet giving details of each of them, but offering no further information about Penelope. Gervase had a long life, surviving for almost 80 years. He was the posthumous son of George Clifton and succeeded to the estates at the age of 4 months on the death of his grandfather. The Nottingham historian Dr. Robert Thoroton, who attended him in his last illness, described him as follows in the History of Nottinghamshire from 1676. Sir Gervase was certainly more gentle than his grandfather, being generally the most noted person of his time for courtesy. He was very prosperous and beloved of all. He generously, hospitably, charitably entertained all from King Charles himself, of whom he was an active supporter, to the poorest beggar. He served 8 times in several parliaments. He was an extraordinary kind landlord and a good master. His hospitality exceeded very many of the nobility, and his continuance on it most men. Being almost 80 years lord of this place, of a sound body and a cheerful facetious spirit. Indeed, as more recent historians have noted, he had an eye for the ladies, rich ones that is, and preferably older, the money from which was used to pay off his debts to Parliament. The monument to Gervase Clifton's first 3 wives used to sit here close to the mausoleum. It was, however, considered to be hideous, and in the 19th century was moved out of the way to the north transept. You'll have a chance to make up your own mind shortly. You can just see it tucked on the left out of the way. And here it is, a very strange creation indeed. On first impression, it looks as though the plasterer and the decorator failed to come back to finish off the job. At the top is the Clifton crest, surmounted by a skull. There are 2 cherubs, one with a mallet and the other one kneeling on a skull and leaning on what appears to be a broom. Further down there are 2 winged hourglasses, 2 small obelisks bearing coats of arms, and a fake coffin, just slabs of marble on concrete, at the front of the coats of arms of the 3 wives. Even stranger, below this, carved in marble, is a case containing 6 skulls and an assortment of bones, including a sacrum, a vertebra, and a hand, hardly a pleasant reminder of loved ones. And why 6? Fascinating though all of this is, it is, however, the carved inscription which interests us, for it's here that Penelope's age is inscribed. The first thing to note is that there's a lot of text here on a stone around 1 metre square. This would not have been a task delegated to the trainee stonemason. One error and it's ruined. This is the piece relevant to Penelope Clifford, which translates as, to preserve the memory of his lovely wives, Penelope, daughter of Robert, Earl of Warwick, and Penelope his wife, a woman in body as in soul the most beautiful to be seen, who after 5 years of marriage perished. She bore 1 son, Gervase, died and was brought here. She died on the 26th of October, 1613, aged 23. Firstly, she was not the daughter of Robert Rich, and by this stage everyone would have known this. So that is the first falsehood. Secondly, we know she was not 23, yet here it is set in stone. The part that I want you to look at, the age in Roman numerals, is on the right. The ending of the date is somewhat unclear, being right on the edge of the stone. What I've done here is to use a torch to highlight the engraving. and as you can see, it clearly shows the number 23. There is, however, something strange about it. The 3 1s are crammed in at the edge of the tablet. The stonemason would have planned out his text before engraving, so there would have been no need to run out of space. If we return to the whole tablet, you can see that there's a definite centre line around which most of the text is constructed. There is some variation in the size of the text for any given line according to the number of letters and numbers to be included. Throughout, the mason has oversized the Roman numerals. And here is the whole line of text showing the edges of the tablet and the beginning of the text. There is a large space on the left, so there's no need to run out of space on the right. Earlier in the line we have the Roman numerals for 1613. The characters are both large and evenly spaced. Surely by this point the mason would have known that he was in trouble fitting it all in. Yet he sails on, leaving plenty of space between the T and I of aetatis. Below are 2 more examples from elsewhere in the text where X is followed by 3 1s. Was this just an error on the part of the stonemason? Personally, I doubt it. Look again at the torchlight image. If we remove the last 2 characters, the result would look something like this, and I'm very suspicious that an alteration has been made. So why on earth would that have happened? To understand, you need to know about Charles Blount's will. Born in March of 1592 and died in October of 1613, Penelope would have been 21. If she was 5 years married, as the text of the memorial tells us, then she was 16 at the time of her marriage, a full 2 years before she was able to claim any dowry. The year of the marriage was probably 1609, as suggested by Sally Varlow. Unfortunately, I've been unable to locate a copy of the will, so I will rely on the account given in Sally Varlow's biography. Charles Blount was an extremely wealthy man, having built up a huge portfolio of properties, and the distant members of his family were prepared to fight hard to get it. Varlow tells us that it was a deed of trust as well as his will. His properties were to pass directly to his beneficiaries from his trustees. His wife, Penelope, was to have a life interest in all his properties. On her death it would pass to the children. These were named in order of inheritance: Mountjoy, St. John, Charles, Penelope and Isabella. There were annual maintenance payments for each child and large dowries, in Penelope's case £5,000. Devonshire's relatives were having none of it. They fought Penelope in every court open to them, challenging the legality of her marriage, her character, the will, the trust deed and the children's paternity. The challenges mounted, even reaching the Star Chamber, and it was not until May of 1607 that the will was finally upheld for the 3rd and final time. By the 7th of July 1607, Penelope, Countess of Devonshire, was dead. Following the death of Penelope, her estate was distributed according to her will. By this stage, Penelope Blount had met the 21-year-old Gervase Clifton. My suspicion is that her age was exaggerated in order for her to claim her dowry and share of the Blount estate early, before any further challenges were issued by the family. This is why she had to be 23, not 21 or 22. After all, by this stage her parents were both dead, and her siblings appear to have remained a close group, each in line for an inheritance. It's not as though by claiming early she would have taken more than was her due. It's not known how much this would all have amounted to. Claiming her father to have been Robert Rich would have also conveniently thrown any gold diggers off her trail. As for Gervase, well, judging by his later behaviour, he was a bit of a wide boy, plying his charms in order to enrich himself. What have we learned? Well, it's been of great interest to take a closer look at the life of Penelope Blount. Remember, this is all about whether or not her mother, Penelope Rich, could have also been the mother of Henry de Vere, with the father as Henry Wriothesley, thereby making a cuckold of Edward de Vere and setting her up as the Dark Lady of the Sonnets. We've learned that Elizabethans, for the fear of God, baptised early, within a week of birth. I hope, therefore, I've been able to show that Penelope Blount was 21 and not 23 at the time of her death. Her birth date is extremely close to the date of conception of Henry de Vere, making a shared mother very unlikely. Her exaggerated age was all about securing her inheritance, aided no doubt by her avaricious husband Gervase. If she had been 23 at death, her pregnancy would have overlapped with that of her older half-brother Henry Rich. The layout of her age on the monument shows irregularities which support the view that it was altered by the addition of 2 ones. If Penelope Rich was not the mother of Henry de Vere, 18th Earl of Oxford, who was? Little serious thought has been given to it being Elizabeth Trentham, wife of Edward de Vere. It seems to me from my research that there's much more to this marriage than love. The Trenthams, if you like, had an agenda, as I described in my previous presentation. It's also possible that Edward de Vere had a relationship with her for some time prior to marriage. Indeed, she may have been his mistress in our usual sense of the word. It's been suggested that Edward de Vere convinced Henry Wriothesley to sire a child for him with Penelope Rich. In the light of my findings, this scenario no longer holds. Similarly, it would have been very strange to engage Henry Wriothesley to impregnate his wife, being as they'd only been married for less than 12 months. As I discussed in an earlier presentation, there always remains the possibility that Henry Wriothesley was the child of Elizabeth I and Edward de Vere. Under these circumstances, the scandal would have been greatly amplified, although strangely Henry de Vere would still have been eligible to be the next Earl of Oxford, being the grandson of the 17th Earl. Perhaps a good enough reason to raise him as such. The embarrassment of the behaviour of Henry Wriothesley may have led to his being out of favour with the Queen for the rest of his life, and one reason she was unwilling to name him as a successor. Like many of you, I've read the sonnets many times and never cease to be amazed by how much more I understand on each reading. Here's an interesting thought. Whenever we use the term mistress today, we invariably think of an affair between a married man and another woman. The terms Mrs. and Miss all derive from the same root, and in Tudor times the usage could just as well refer to someone's wife. Try reading the Dark Lady sonnets beginning at number 127 with this in mind, and consider for yourself whether or not he was referring to his wife. And here is the sign of the times. We were shown around St Mary's Church by a charming church warden called Ron Hancock. At the end of our visit he pointed to a small rug on the floor of the church. Peeling it back revealed the tomb of the Black Prince. This is not the Black Prince who was the son of Edward III, but a Black Prince who was once in the employ of the Clifton family. The inscription reads, "Here lieth the body of Joseph, commonly called the Black Prince, who was converted to the Christian faith Anno Domini 1675 and died on the 1st day of June Anno Domini 1685, in the hope of a better life." The point of showing the tomb was that shortly before our visit, a member of the Woke Brigade came to investigate whether or not this man was a victim of slavery. The warden told them that this was hardly the case, as he is buried in the church not far from the altar. Joseph was very tall, approaching 7 feet, and indeed his height is engraved on the stone entrance to the church. I.P. Josephus Princeps. Once again, thank you very much for watching.